When the Second World War expanded into the Pacific, the confrontation between the United States and Imperial Japan quickly became dominated by naval aviation. Aircraft carriers replaced battleships as the center of fleet power, and the fight for control of the skies above that vast ocean would decide the outcome of the conflict. At the beginning of this struggle, the Japanese Navy enjoyed a clear advantage. Their pilots were extensively trained, battle-hardened from years of war in China, and they possessed a fighter aircraft that surpassed anything the United States could field in 1941, the Mitsubishi A6M, known as the Zero. The Zero entered combat with revolutionary characteristics for its time. It combined formidable agility with an impressive operational range, allowing Japanese carriers to strike faraway targets long before the enemy could respond. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi, the aircraft sacrificed weight and structural protection in order to enhance maneuverability and endurance. It lacked self-sealing fuel tanks and sufficient armor for the pilot, but these omissions allowed it to turn faster and fly longer than any opponent during the early war period. Armed with two 20mm cannons and two machine guns, the Zero was deadly in the hands of the skilled aviators of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The initial encounters proved disastrous for American forces. In the skies over the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, U.S. and Allied fighters such as the P-40 Warhawk and the Brewster Buffalo were decisively outclassed. Even at Pearl Harbor, though the surprise attack relied mainly on bombers and torpedo planes, the escorting Zeros demonstrated their superiority against the limited American air defense that attempted to resist. Japanese naval air power expanded rapidly across the Pacific, controlling wide territories with unprecedented reach. At that moment, the Zero seemed nearly unbeatable. However, the success of the Zero and the early triumphs of Japanese naval aviation masked underlying vulnerabilities. Pilot training was long and rigorous, resulting in an elite but relatively small force of aviators, difficult to replace once losses mounted. Moreover, Japan-U.S. industry lacked the capacity to rapidly produce advanced aircraft on the same scale as the United States. The war became a contest not only of skill and technology, but of logistics, development, and industrial resilience. The Americans understood that to challenge the Zero, they would need more than incremental improvements. They required a fighter designed specifically to overcome its strengths. This realization ignited the development of a new generation of U.S. Navy fighters intended to seize the initiative in aerial combat. Engineers at Grumman Aircraft Corporation began creating a carrier-based fighter that would surpass the Zero not by copying its formula, but by countering its weaknesses. The result would be an aircraft more powerful, resilient, and effective within the broader strategic demands of the Pacific War. Soon, a new machine would take flight, one capable of reversing the course of the conflict in the air. Grumman's engineers approached their task with the urgency demanded by war. They studied every encounter report available, learning how the Zero achieved its dominance and where it was vulnerable. American pilots who had survived dogfights with the Japanese shared crucial tactical observations. The Zero excelled at low-speed maneuvering but lost responsiveness at high speeds. Its airframe could not withstand steep dives, and its lack of armor made it highly susceptible to damage once hit. These weaknesses guided the design process. The new fighter was built around a powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, significantly stronger than that of the Zero. Rather than aiming for extreme agility at low speed, the designers prioritized rugged construction, higher dive speed, greater firepower, and better protection for the pilot. The resulting aircraft was the Grumman F6F, soon to gain a name that would resonate throughout the Pacific, Hellcat. Introduced into combat in 1943, the Hellcat entered the war at a crucial turning point. By this time, Japan had already suffered major losses in carriers and, more critically, in veteran air crews. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had destroyed 4 of Japan's frontline carriers and cost them many of their most skilled pilots. Subsequent battles in the Solomon Islands further eroded the elite core of aviators who had once made the Zero a fearsome presence. In contrast, the United States expanded its pilot training programs dramatically, producing aviators in quantities that Japan could not match. The Hellcat was more than just a replacement for outdated American fighters. It was a decisive statement of industrial and technological superiority. It featured a strong, robust airframe that could absorb heavy damage and still remain operational. The cockpit was surrounded by armor plating, and its fuel tanks were protected to reduce the risk of fire. A wide landing gear improved safety on carrier decks, significantly lowering the rate of operational accidents. Equipped with 650 caliber machine guns, the Hellcat delivered a devastating volume of fire capable of destroying enemy aircraft with short bursts. Perhaps most important was that U.S. naval doctrine evolved alongside the new machine. American tactics shifted to exploit the Hellcat's strengths, maintaining altitude, engaging in high-speed dives, and avoiding turning contests with Zeros. Radar-guided fighter direction from carriers and land bases became increasingly sophisticated, allowing American patrols to intercept enemy formations with growing effectiveness. The combination of improved strategy, superior numbers, and a better aircraft began to reverse the air balance of the Pacific. Initial encounters between the Hellcat and the Zero demonstrated the magnitude of the shift. Where once American pilots had been forced into desperate defensive fights, they now approached combat with confidence. Reports from 1943 onward show that the Hellcat consistently outperformed the Zero in almost every aspect of aerial combat. As the United States pushed its offensive across the Pacific, the skies that had once belonged to Japan began to slip from its grasp. As the Pacific War intensified, the Hellcat became the spearhead of American carrier aviation. With its arrival, U.S. operations expanded into regions that had once been considered invulnerable to attack. Battles such as those in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands proved how dramatically the balance had shifted. From the decks of Essex-class carriers, large formations of Hellcats patrolled ahead of bombers, sweeping the skies of enemy resistance. By early 1944, the Japanese Navy faced a worsening crisis. The once dominant Zero was no longer a symbol of invincibility. Although Japan introduced improved variants, such as the A6M5 with strengthened wings and higher speed limits in dives, these efforts could not compensate for the aircraft's foundational compromises. Its design philosophy, so effective in 1941, was becoming a fatal liability. Light construction and the absence of protective armor meant that even glancing hits from heavy machine gun fire could cripple the aircraft or kill the pilot instantly. Meanwhile, American pilots benefited from the growing experience of continuous combat, as well as superior training methods designed to produce both large numbers of aviators and high standards of proficiency. U.S. aircraft carriers equipped with advanced radar further enhanced tactical awareness. Japanese formations that once attacked with surprise now found themselves detected early, intercepted, and scattered before they could reach their targets. The clash reached its defining moment during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Determined to halt the U.S. advance toward the Marianas, Japan committed the largest remaining concentration of its naval air power. The outcome proved catastrophic for the Imperial Navy. In what American pilots later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Hellcat demonstrated utter dominance over the Zero and other Japanese fighters. Poorly trained replacements, unable to match the skill of lost veterans, flew into combat with outdated tactics and inferior machines. The result was a slaughter in the air. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed with minimal American losses. This battle not only ensured U.S. control of the skies but also permanently crippled Japanese naval aviation. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, had been outpaced by evolving technology and crushed by a far greater industrial power. Even so, Japan continued to rely heavily on the A6M. It remained the most common fighter in its arsenal until the very end of the war, not because it was still effective, but because Japan lacked a suitable replacement and the production capacity to field more advanced designs in significant numbers. As U.S. carrier groups moved steadily closer to the Japanese mainland, Hellcats became a constant presence above every major engagement. What had begun as a battle for superiority had become a systematic conquest of the air. The Hellcat's impact was not limited to aerial victories alone. Its introduction forced a profound reevaluation of Japanese naval strategy. Encounters with the American fighter revealed the limitations of the Zero, and, by extension, the vulnerability of the pilots who had once been considered the elite of naval aviation. No longer could Japan rely on superior maneuverability to offset numerical inferiority. Combat now demanded industrial strength, coordinated tactics, and technological sophistication, areas in which Japan lagged behind. Japanese pilots, even the most skilled, found themselves confronting a new reality. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, a celebrated ace, had once faced American aircraft with confidence, relying on the exceptional handling of the Zero to evade and outmaneuver opponents. When encountering the Hellcat, however, even his extraordinary skill was tested to the limit. Reports from survivors describe engagements where the Hellcat's heavy frame, powerful engine, and .650 caliber guns transformed the skies into a deadly environment. Vertical maneuvers, high-speed dives, and energy retention tactics rendered the traditional Japanese dogfighting techniques ineffective. The disparity was further exacerbated by the cumulative loss of experienced pilots. The Zero had initially been flown by aviators who underwent years of rigorous training, accumulating hundreds of flight hours before combat. By 1944, however, Japan was producing pilots with only a fraction of that experience, often less than 50 to 70 hours, barely enough to handle the aircraft under normal conditions, let alone in a life-or-death engagement against a Hellcat. In contrast, U.S. pilots trained extensively on their specific aircraft type, performing thousands of practice rounds and mastering carrier operations before facing the enemy. The combination of superior equipment, rigorous preparation, and coordinated tactics gave the U.S. Navy a decisive edge. Engagements in late 1944, such as the battles over Formosa and the Philippine Sea, highlighted the extent of this imbalance. Japanese formations attempted to mount large-scale offensives, but the Hellcats, flying in disciplined divisions, intercepted and destroyed waves of attackers with minimal losses. Tactics that had once guaranteed Japanese success, including turning fights and surprise maneuvers, now played directly into American hands. The sheer industrial and tactical advantage of the United States meant that no single encounter could reverse the trend. Japan's losses continued to mount, eroding both its fleet and the confidence of its surviving pilots. The Hellcat had become more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of a new approach to warfare. While the Zero represented the pinnacle of skill-focused design, prioritizing the individual pilot's abilities above all else, the Hellcat embodied the systematic integration of engineering, training, and industrial capacity. The contrast between the two philosophies was stark. Japan's elite pilots, no matter how skilled, were increasingly matched and outmatched by a system that leveraged every advantage in production, technology, and coordinated combat. By 1945, the technological and operational gap between the United States and Japan had become insurmountable. The Hellcat had evolved into the central pillar of American carrier air power, its design continually refined to meet new challenges. Upgraded models featured improved armor, enhanced weapon sights, and increased engine performance, including water injection systems that temporarily boosted power for critical combat maneuvers. Each modification made the Hellcat even more lethal, while Japanese aircraft struggled to keep pace. The introduction of kamikaze tactics by Japan highlighted the desperation of its position. Pilots, trained inadequately due to fuel shortages and the accelerated training programs, were sent into combat with minimal experience, often in aircraft that were already outclassed. The Hellcat, however, proved resilient even in these extreme conditions. Its robustness and speed allowed American pilots to intercept suicide attacks before they could reach their targets, significantly reducing potential damage to the fleet. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, leading a division of Hellcats during the Okinawa campaign, exemplified the tactical mastery that American aviators brought to the field. His division, employing coordinated formations of 4 aircraft, executed systematic sweeps of Japanese attack waves, combining speed, altitude advantage, and synchronized firing to devastating effect. Over the course of the Okinawa campaign, Hellcats flew more than 38,000 sorties, achieving over 2,350 aerial victories while sustaining only 249 losses, a kill ratio of nearly 10-1. Moreover, they successfully prevented roughly 80% of kamikaze aircraft from reaching their targets, demonstrating not only offensive superiority, but also defensive effectiveness on a massive scale. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. Veterans of the early war, once confident in their superior skill and in the performance of the Zero, found themselves facing an enemy that operated as a coordinated machine rather than individual warriors. The effectiveness of radar-guided interceptions, combined with the Hellcat's durability and firepower, created a sense of inevitability in combat. The Hellcat psychosis, as later identified by military analysts, reflected the erosion of morale among Japanese aviators who faced overwhelming odds with insufficient training and obsolete equipment. Meanwhile, Japanese leaders recognized the grim reality. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of the kamikaze program, rationalized the tactic through stark mathematics. Conventional attacks by Zeros against carriers offered near-zero chances of success, while kamikaze missions increased the probability of inflicting damage, albeit at the cost of the pilot's life. Even in these measures of desperation, the Hellcat continued to dominate. Pilots like Hiroyoshi Nishiwa, once among Japan's most successful aces, met their end at the hands of the very aircraft they had previously defeated, illustrating the absolute ascendancy of the American fighter. The Hellcat had transformed the Pacific theater. By combining industrial production, technological innovation, tactical coordination, and rigorous pilot training, the United States produced a system capable of annihilating Japan's naval air power. The Zero, for all its early brilliance, could not compete against the cumulative advantage of numbers, firepower, armor, and coordinated strategy. By the time of Japan's surrender, the legacy of the Hellcat was clear. It had not only defeated enemy aircraft, it had destroyed an entire philosophy of aerial combat. Following Japan's surrender in August 1945, the full extent of the Hellcat's dominance became evident. On the airfields of Atsugi, Japanese personnel, pilots, mechanics, and ground crews witnessed firsthand the aircraft that had so decisively reshaped the Pacific Air War. 12 F6F Hellcats from the USS Yorktown landed, bringing the war machine to the former enemy's doorstep. American pilots demonstrated maneuvers that were previously unimaginable to Japanese aviators. Sharp loops, rapid rolls, vertical climbs, and sustained high-speed turns, all without losing structural integrity. Lieutenant Robert Vasu, an ace with 19 confirmed victories, explained through an interpreter that the Hellcat's performance was not pushed to its limits. With water injection, it could generate 20% more power and endure stresses of up to 13 G without failure. Post-war inspections confirmed what Japanese engineers had suspected. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, the heart of the Hellcat, was built with extreme precision. Nearly 3,000 components were fully interchangeable, allowing rapid repairs and replacements. The Nakajima Sakai engines of the Zero, by contrast, required individualized assembly, with no 2 engines exactly alike. Horikoshi, the designer of the Zero, studied the Hellcat and reached a sobering conclusion. "We designed an aircraft for 1941. They built an aviation system for 1945. While we perfected the sword, they constructed the industrial age." The scale of production further reinforced the disparity. Between 1942 and 1945, Japan produced approximately 500 fighters per year, including all types. In contrast, the United States produced 35,000 aircraft in a single year at the peak of Hellcat production. The Grumman factory at Bethpage, New York, operated around the clock, assembling a Hellcat every hour. Entire assembly lines employed color-coded instructions, rigorous quality control, and continuous operations to maintain output at unprecedented levels. This industrial efficiency became a strategic weapon in itself, ensuring that the U.S. could sustain offensive operations while replacing losses almost instantly. The operational consequences were clear. American carriers protected by waves of Hellcats could remain near enemy shores with minimal risk, conducting sustained offensive operations. Japanese tactics, rooted in individual heroism and the Bushido tradition, clashed with the systematic efficiency of the Hellcat. The Zero had emphasized the pilot's skill and courage. The Hellcat emphasized coordinated action, industrial reliability, and maximum survivability. Japanese aviators, trained as samurai of the sky, could not adapt to a conflict waged as a machine of war rather than as individual duels. By the end of the Pacific War, the F6F Hellcat had destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft, with only 270 losses in aerial combat, yielding a kill ratio of 19.3 to 1. Of the 18,000 Japanese naval aviators who had begun the conflict, fewer than 100 remained with significant combat experience. The Zero, once the embodiment of Japanese air supremacy, had been rendered obsolete, not by a single act of heroism, but by the systematic application of superior technology, strategy, and industrial capacity. The Hellcat had redefined the mathematics of aerial warfare and, in doing so, had reshaped the fate of nations. Following Japan's surrender in August 1945, the full extent of the Hellcat's dominance became evident. On the airfields of Atsugi, Japanese personnel, pilots, mechanics, and ground crews witnessed firsthand the aircraft that had so decisively reshaped the Pacific Air War. 12 F6F Hellcats from the USS Yorktown landed, bringing the war machine to the former enemy's doorstep. American pilots demonstrated maneuvers that were previously unimaginable to Japanese aviators: sharp loops, rapid rolls, vertical climbs, and sustained high-speed turns, all without losing structural integrity. Lieutenant Robert Vasu, an ace with 19 confirmed victories, explained through an interpreter that the Hellcat's performance was not pushed to its limits. With water injection, it could generate 20% more power and endure stresses of up to 13 G without failure. Post-war inspections confirmed what Japanese engineers had suspected. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, the heart of the Hellcat, was built with extreme precision. Nearly 3,000 components were fully interchangeable, allowing rapid repairs and replacements. The Nakajima Sakai engines of the Zero, by contrast, required individualized assembly, with no two engines exactly alike. Horikoshi, the designer of the Zero, studied the Hellcat and reached a sobering conclusion. We designed an aircraft for 1941. They built an aviation system for 1945. While we perfected the sword, they constructed the industrial age. The scale of production further reinforced the disparity. Between 1942 and 1945, Japan produced approximately 5,100 fighters per year, including all types. In contrast, the United States produced 35,000 aircraft in a single year at the peak of Hellcat production. The Grumman factory at Bethpage, New York, operated around the clock, assembling a Hellcat every hour. Entire assembly lines employed color-coded instructions, rigorous quality control, and continuous operations to maintain output at unprecedented levels. This industrial efficiency became a strategic weapon in itself, ensuring that the U.S. could sustain offensive operations while replacing losses almost instantly. The operational consequences were clear. American carriers, protected by waves of Hellcats, could remain near enemy shores with minimal risk, conducting sustained offensive operations. Japanese tactics, rooted in individual heroism and the Bushido tradition, clashed with the systematic efficiency of the Hellcat. The Zero had emphasized the pilot's skill and courage. The Hellcat emphasized coordinated action, industrial reliability, and maximum survivability. Japanese aviators trained as samurai of the sky could not adapt to a conflict waged as a machine of war rather than as individual duels. By the end of the Pacific War, the F6F Hellcat had destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft, with only 270 losses in aerial combat, yielding a kill ratio of 19.3 to 1. Of the 18,000 Japanese naval aviators who had begun the conflict, fewer than 100 remained with significant combat experience. The Zero, once the embodiment of Japanese air supremacy, had been rendered obsolete, not by a single act of heroism, but by the systematic application of superior technology, strategy, and industrial capacity. The Hellcat had redefined the mathematics of aerial warfare and, in doing so, had reshaped the fate of nations.